historical swing of the pendulum between democracy and authoritarianism that has characterized the region for decades. The Democratic Charter was, in fact, the end of a long-standing discussion about the promotion and defense of democracy and human rights. That started in Bogota in 1948 with the establishment of the OAS. It became stronger in the 90s after the Cold War and democratic transitions in many countries, and ended in April 2001 with the Summit of the Americas in Quebec, instructing the ministers of foreign affairs to prepare a democratic charter enabling a collective and robust defense of democracy by the OAS. Since its approval, the Democratic Charter has been invoked on several occasions: in Venezuela in 2002, Paraguay and Honduras in 2009, Ecuador and Haiti in 2010, and more recently in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Over these 2 decades, the effectiveness of the defense and strengthening of the Democratic Charter has been challenged on several occasions by the civil society, academia, and states themselves. Many times, the need to reform the Charter has been raised, as well as to set up additional mechanisms. Attaining the original goals of a collective defense of democracy more efficiently may be attained, and especially preventively. Another element is the lack of basic consensus and lack of commitment to regional goals by the states. In fact, one form to evaluate the efficacy of the Charter in the region is to analyze the status of current democracies in the Americas. Along these lines, the Democratic Charter's record is far from outstanding. Just a glance across the countries in the region shows an alarming reality. In addition to the terrible and dramatic situations in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and of course Cuba, there are authoritarian trends in many countries like El Salvador. No doubt many of the essential elements of democracy established by the Charter itself are no longer in place. In other countries, there are signs of concern about the health of our democracies. These countries include, of course, my own country, the United States, which until not so long ago put at serious risk more than 200 years of democracy. Considering the serious condition of democracy in several countries in the region and the strongly relative efficacy that the Charter has had over these past 2 decades, I believe we should take advantage of this anniversary to reflect upon the way in which we can strengthen the mechanism set up by the Charter and analyze why this mechanism has not been stronger and more effective for the collective defense of democracy. The Inter-American Dialogue has organized many meetings on the status of democracy for almost 4 decades, including very productive and interesting discussions about the meaning of the Charter 20 years ago. Fortunately, today we have the presence of 4 protagonists and key characters of the defense of democracy, the rule of law, and the human rights in the regions. We are very happy to have joined us the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, who will say a few words to start the session. The Secretary General, who has had a long-standing diplomatic and professional career, has been re-elected for a 2nd term on March the 20th, 2020. During these 5 years as the Secretary General, there has been many interesting times in the region. He had previously been foreign minister in Uruguay, and He has also been ambassador in Beijing. After the presentation by the Secretary General, we'll have our commentators, including Maricler Acosta from Mexico and Diego Garcia from Peru, also with a deep knowledge of the human rights world and democracies in Latin America. It's really a privilege and an honor to have them on our
a value I would call constitutional in terms of systemic politics. It has a great constitutional value. References of the Inter-American Court of Justice recently regarding the Inter-American Democratic Charter is very clear in that what has been included now forms part of the legal background of the Americas and is an essential reference. The Charter is an essential reference, essential legal and political reference. It's key to the countries in the hemisphere. However, I should say that the Charter should not be blamed for violations of the Charter. The rule cannot be responsible for violations of the rule, or the constitutions can't be responsible for the permanent violations to the constitutions that may occur in different political systems. The Charter has tried to note this and is a legal reference which is mandatory for our countries, which should work on it, support it, strengthen it, look at it, to make the principles contained in it effective, the mechanisms for defense of democracy that it contains, and of course, the best actions we can take to ensure better working of democracy and making it more effective in solving problems. The preventive stage is related to democratic clauses, which there have also been in different regional and sub-regional mechanisms. We have not only the Declaration of Quebec with its democratic clause, the Declaration of Nassau with, you will remember, it developed mechanisms to provide help to states to promote, preserve, and strengthen representative democracies. The Declaration of Managua is an essential preventive mechanism for promoting democracy and development. Peace, development are inseparable, indivisible from solidarity in the Americas, is what the Charter says, but inspired in the DNA, the libertarian DNA of the national independencies of our countries. Democracy clearly has to be preserved with its essential values and principles, but we need continuous work to consolidate it. And this continuous work to consolidate it has sometimes facilitated, and countries sometimes due to omission or sometimes with the clear purpose of creating alterations in constitutional order. We have to continue to anticipate the causes of the problems affecting the democratic systems in the hemisphere. The Charter is, as it says at the end, it points out that it's part of the progressive development of international law and the need to include the clauses that should be related to defending democratic institutions in agreement with the practices established. This is one of the recurrent accusations, particularly of those who recurrently violate the democratic charter. And that is, it sometimes shows an interventional character of the charter when the first article of the charter of the OAS is very clear regarding interference refers to internal topics which the inter-American system complements, so they are not exclusively responsibility of the state. So it is not right to invoke an interfering character. The elements which are essential that have been mentioned in Article 3, the main components of the Article 4, but above all, Article 1, which establishes a right to democracy for the peoples of the Americas. Governments have to promote and defend it. That obligation to promote and defend it by governments is what sometimes has been missing. The Charter has served to channel very often those problems. The first to invoke the Inter-American Charter was Venezuela with Chavez, although it did not concur with what happened later and in recent years regarding his jurisdiction regarding application of the Charter. The Charter has served to provide solutions in almost all cases in which it has been applied. Alteration of constitutional order has been declared when it has happened. Illegitimacy of a determined given government has been declared when that has happened. The elements which are essential in democracy, respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, subject to the rule of law, democratic rule of law, periodical free elections, sovereignty of the people, which is often violated, the plural regime of parties and the separation between the different branches of state. Article 4, we shouldn't forget, it's connected to subjects which are essential regarding public responsibility, connected to probity, government activities, legitimate authorities, and the right to institutional operation and how it should be organized in this rule of law, all the different elements of society. The Charter considers rights and freedoms which are fundamental in Chapter 2, democracy and human rights. It's very clear about any kind of discrimination, very clear about protection of human rights, of civil rights and political rights in the states, and also social and economic rights are directly considered in Article 3. This is one of the key topics because one of the structural problems in democracy in the hemisphere is connected to inequality, social inequality. The best protection and promotion of economic and social rights is crucial for better functioning of democracy. Mechanisms to defend democracy are sometimes driven by the country affected, but also all the states. Article 20 is very clear in this regard. All states are responsible for democracy in the hemisphere. This is not interventionism, it's just a collective responsibility, a very ancient collective responsibility. Simón Bolívar said so. The Republican system of the government is our system. Those who cannot comply with it should be suspended from this community of nations. We were talking about the beginning of the 19th century. The mechanisms are basically diplomatic. They're all diplomatic mechanisms, negotiations, mechanisms to promote institutionality in democracy. Clearly, The resolutions that are approved are connected to considering the situation which may occur in a state with regard to its rule of law or its institutional functioning or alteration of constitutional order or the rupture of democratic order. Missions of electoral observation are contained in the Charter and are given political responsibilities that are very strong. Articles 23 and 24 are clear regarding guaranteeing free and fair electoral processes, guaranteeing safety, information, and that the electoral missions should be done according to the principles and standards of the OAS, ensuring the independence of these missions. The electoral observation missions go through the Permanent Council. If there were not conditions needed for free, fair elections, if they're not free, fair elections, this would definitely be a need for political action by the observations. Clearly, the subjects of democracy are involved in what is our democratic culture. All our countries were born as democracies, some more imperfect, others better, but all as democracies. That is a key point.
And that's the last article referring to the egalitarian participation of women that reinforces the variables of non-discrimination in previous articles. I hope not to have been too long in this regard, but it's a review of the Charter that is essential for the constitutional values that it has for the Americas, and the Charter makes it very clear what shouldn't be violated, but the problem is what governments or political actors do still today violate the supreme legal norm. Santiago Canton, please, you have the floor. Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Michael for his presentation and the Secretary General for his presentation too. Before we move on, I would like to make some housekeeping announcements. We have interpretation into English. You can select simultaneous interpretation. And in the last 30 minutes of the event, participants will answer questions from the audience. So you can send your questions by Zoom or through email to meetings@thedialogue.org. You can send your questions to that email address and will be answered in the last 30 minutes of the meeting. Before Diego Garcia, Sayan, and Maricler Acosta comment on the presentation by the Secretary General and also in connection with our own experience, I think we are lucky enough to have these three individuals and also the president of the Inter-American Dialogue, Michael Shifter. They all accumulate information of the past years in connection with governments, civil society, and multilateral agencies. That's very rich and can facilitate and help the dialogue we are having right now to be favored by their knowledge, especially in connection with the topic of the rule of law, democracy, and human rights. I'll try for my questions orient the debate, the discussion, but it's important that participants feel at ease to interact whenever they deem it appropriate. The main goal of this meeting is to provoke ideas to strengthen the rule of law in the region, which, as I understand it, is going through one of its worst moments since the beginning of the third democratic wave about 40 years ago. We are not celebrating actually 20 years of the Democratic Charter because there are not many reasons for celebration. This is the longest democratic period from the history of independence, but the swing of the authoritarian pendulum is coming back. So the question is what shall we do to halt it, to avoid a new history of authoritarianism that has characterized our region, unfortunately, and which on many occasions has involved the death of millions of people. And as Michael Shifter said at the beginning, this is important not only for Latin America, but also for the United States, where the rule of law has been also put at risk. So it's really important that we think what else we can do. The Secretary General, in his presentation, mentioned the Democratic Charter in itself, and it's clear that this charter has been a very important and continues to be a very important document. There are no similar international documents with all the richness of this document as to the establishment of essential elements, contents, and mechanisms for reform. But undoubtedly, beyond the importance of this charter, answers have not been found. And this is the main reason or the main topic we would like to discuss today. I will now introduce Diego Garcia Sajan and Maricler Acosta, and then I will ask them a few questions. And please, I would like to know your comments on the presentation of the Secretary General. Diego is now the current special rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. He was elected in 2016. He was president and vice president of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. He was a special envoy of the Secretary General for El Salvador when peace agreements were being discussed, a key topic that you can see reflected in the current situation of El Salvador. He was also a member of the work group on arbitrary disappearance of persons. He went on an electoral mission of the OAS in Guatemala in 2017. He has wide experience in multilateral agencies, and he was a Minister of Justice in Peru and also foreign minister in Peru when at the time of the discussions or the submission by Peru and the discussion at the OAS of the Democratic Charter. So he is aware of the process that developed and led to the Democratic Charter. And Maricler Acosta is from Mexico. She has wide experience not only in terms of government, but also in terms of civil society from Mexico and the globe. She has experience in the OAS and in the Mexican government as an undersecretary of human rights. He also worked at the High Commission Office of Human Rights of the United Nations, and she is currently the president of Justicia Transicional Mexico, which is an organization that tries to put an end to impunity for violations of human rights in Mexico in the past decades. So the panel couldn't be best. I will start with Diego with a question for him. Diego, as I've just mentioned, you participated in the key moments of the development of the Democratic Charter, as history tells us, especially the former Secretary General of the UN, Pérez de Cuellar, who at the time I think was the chief of cabinet of his government, promoted the idea of developing a democratic charter for the region, something that was quite innovative in the world and also risky. Every time we speak of democracy, the civil society and the states are concerned as to how we are going to define it, but finally consensus was reached and it was approved. So I would like to start with that. Could you please tell us about that initial process? What items were taken into consideration when thinking of an Inter-American Democratic Charter? And also please comment on the presentation of the Secretary General. So Diego, you have the floor. It's not necessary. I don't need your comments anyway, right? Thank you very much. Santiago, thank you very much for your presentation. It's really a pleasure for me to participate in this event sponsored by the dialogue presided over by Michael Shifter and meet very close friends such as Luis Almagro and Maricler Acosta and discuss such a controversial topic because, as the Secretary General has pointed out, as there are constitution and treaties on in the international arena, there are specific situations where these are not actually met, but that doesn't denaturalize those elements and those legal instruments. Otherwise, the order across the planet would be destroyed. They mark certain substantive principles and procedures to avoid or face violations to constitutions or international treaties or legal instruments such as the Inter-American Democratic Charter. So the fact that there may be types or trends related to authoritarianism, not only in Latin America, as Santiago has mentioned, and the United States, but also in democratic Europe right now. In democratic Europe, European countries meet to see what they can do to prevent attacks in Poland, for instance, and also there could be economic tools as discussed in the Council of Europe, in connection with the instruments that are being distributed in Europe as a result of the pandemic. The idea is to analyze how they can be addressed to Polish authorities. So political instruments have not been enough, and there are other tools Europe is resorting to. So why in America, meaning not only Latin America, in America, a very important step has been taken 20 years ago with the approval of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The role of all members were really relevant, and consensus was reached based on an initiative that started in Peru during the transition government when with Javier Perez de Cuellar as foreign minister, and I was Minister of Justice. On the first message after Perez de Cuellar, which was the president of the Council of Ministers, proposed a democratic charter, the summit of Quebec in April, where it was officially presented to the countries in the Americas. And the idea of this charter was adopted in April, and Peru presented the first draft of the democratic charter several weeks later, which is the text that was discussed and with some modifications adopted on September the 11th, 2001 in Lima, which was the host country, and the General Assembly was held in Lima under the presidency of myself. And this was a substantive step because most legal instruments about democracy adopted by the OAS found the challenge or the threat of being altered through a military coup d'etat. Although those terms were not used at the commitment in Santiago in 1991. The deterioration of democracy from inside, the self-coup like Fujimori, didn't actually open a model to what then happened in many countries, but it was a very important element because of the form in which the regime consolidated, and especially how the regime was faced by an autocracy being born from an autocoup. So when democracy was reestablished, we wanted to translate this into an inter-American instrument to propose to the member states. We were thinking as what had happened in Peru. And that gave us some of the elements to show us how we could sort out that obstacle or that problem. And I would like to mention some of the elements that were decisive or decisive after several years of the Fujimori government at the end of the 90s, in the 2000, when there was a third attempt to re-election violating the constitution, three components that were very important converged to solve peacefully, without any deaths, without any killing, a transition to democracy by the end of the year 2000. The three components were: first, social mobilization, which was relatively important and political in the streets. Second, unity of all the political forces of the opposition and the civil society, not only NGOs, but also business associations too, that participated in the need for a change. And the third element was the participation, and this is the key point that takes us back to the charter, the active participation of the Inter-American community at the time, through the then Foreign Minister of Canada, who had been the president of the last assembly in 2000, held in Canada, Lord Atwater. The Secretary General of the OAS at the time, Cesar Gaviria, presented an initiative including 20 items that were very important for a dialogue to be created in Peru, coordinated by an OAS representation that had to approach all these central points, except for the tax system that was being questioned by the prosecutors in the state, the system to elect judges, and others. So with these two previous components, that is an important social mobilization and the unity of the forces of the opposition, that dialogue in the OAS during the previous months before Fujimori fled, which precipitated the end of the government, several important agreements had been reached. First, the advance of the date of general elections without the participation of Fujimori, the appointment of a new general prosecutor, and those components inspired some of the provisions that were then translated into the first draft that were presented to the OAS for negotiations in May in 2001, which were, of course, reviewed and revised. The first proposal by Peru included the idea that the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights could present to member states evaluations about the evolution of democracy to be considered at the time of analyzing the application or not, or the implementation or not of the charter. This was not incorporated into the charter, for instance. All these elements, I mention all these elements because when some skeptical people say that the charter is no use, in many countries there are autocracies that have been consolidated, other ones are growing, such as the recent steps in El Salvador to terminate the independence of the judiciary, I don't think any of those criticisms puts to question the essence of the democratic charter, because only a written element is not enough, even if those all countries in the continent understand as an essential element to be respected. There are other pieces that are very important, but all this points to showing that proactive efforts of a negotiation with the good offices of the Inter-American system is essentially the objective of Article 20 of the Inter-American Charter. That is, a simplistic scheme saying, well, the Permanent Council meets, or there's an extraordinary session of the General Assembly that agrees on ABC, how such a situation should be solved, but that was not the experience that actually worked. What actually worked is the experience taking account of the reality of political actors that exercise power, and others are on the opposite side against that, and the central negotiating and mediator role of an intergovernmental agency. That's easier said than done, because we cannot repeat successful experiences in one country into another country directly. But this helps to dissuade the simplistic view that some media may have that resists to the majority of 2/3, and they say they solve anything and that decision will be accepted. And we know that's not what actually happens. And then we may also have the situation of the suspension of the state. Poland right now is being pressed with the issue of financial support. The OAS doesn't have that tool. That's true, a dialogue that could be held in the future to articulate the function of intergovernmental loan bodies that operate inside the Inter-American system, that are not incorporated to the OAS, such as CAF, but which act in the hemisphere, who could help solve many strategic issues. So when the charter was adopted on September the 11th that year, that morning, we were having breakfast discussing the US bilateral issues, and we had news about what was happened. I persuaded my colleagues to stay for the voting. The Democratic Charter was approved in that context. Then that same assembly, minutes after the proposal I made as a foreign minister, that America had to prepare an Inter-American Convention against terrorism, was also adopted. Peru presented that project a few weeks later, and it was adopted 1 year later at the General Assembly of the OAS in Barbados. So the substantive role of the OAS was fulfilled in that way.
So some things can be improved in the application of the charter. There can be, we have said several times at the Carta Center that there should be a rapporteur, there should be periodical reports on the evolution of democracy, working as a critical mass for monitoring the democratic system. But in the end, in order to resolve certain democratic crises, there are aspects in which several actors have to take part, not only a text which alone will not be magic in a critical circumstance, and much less so if there's polarization. So thank you very much. With that, I have shared with you a mixture of experience of those days. I was at the round table for dialogue, and I saw something that worked under those conditions, which if a radical resolution of the Assembly or the Council, even if it was not radical, nobody, if they had sent something like that, nobody would have paid attention to it. This created different kind of situation and alliances. Thank you. Thank you, Diego. You have introduced several crucial subjects in our discussion. One is the multilateral credit agencies and the possibility of having some kind of, not sanction, but some kind of mechanism to enable linking the role, our evolution of a country in regard to rule of law and progress, in order for them to receive any kind of loan from these agencies. I want to mention that in my almost 15 years in the Inter-American Human Rights and as executive secretary for several years, I tried to work with the IDB, the World Bank, the IMF. The meetings, we would get the meetings, but the possibility of mentioning the word human rights in the document made them feel really scared. So it was impossible to find some way of linking progress in human rights and democracy to these agencies. And this your example of Poland is an important example of something that we could study. Maricler, great experience in the region, great experience in governments, and especially with civil society, and great contact with civil society in the region. How do you see right now, using as a parameter the Inter-American Charter, how do you see the region? How do you see what's happening in Nicaragua, in Salvador, in your own country, in the US? I know you have knowledge of all these issues, and something that Diego mentioned too. Both Maricler, Diego, and I are members of the group of friends of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, and we've had discussed these topics in several meetings and how we could resolve these difficulties. But we haven't made a lot of progress. So Maricler, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's an important discussion, very interesting. I want to take up what the Secretary General said, what Almagro said, and what Diego Garcia Sayan repeated. We cannot blame the Inter-American Democratic Charter for the regression in democracy in the region. We have to understand what is happening in the reality of the behavior of all the political actors in the region. What am I seeing? I'm seeing democratic regression. And this democratic regression, in it, the democracy is becoming gradually eroded. The erosion in Nicaragua started a long time ago. In Mexico, the erosion of democracy has already got quite a marked road or journey. And this erosion of democracy is supported by this disenchantment with democracy in large parts of the population. Democracy, and this you can see in the surveys, democracy doesn't solve my urgent problems anymore. Survival, health now with the pandemic and so on. So this is like fighting against the current in many situations, especially this all supports these populisms which have taken over in several countries in the region, where elections are won, the leaders and the political parties are elected, certain parties are elected, and that work of erosion begins, eroding institutions, eroding regulations, and in the long term, they gradually destroy everything that supports democracy. I won't go into details because it would take too long, but what should we do? I wouldn't touch the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I think the Inter-American Democratic Charter should not be reformed, doesn't need any changes. As it is, it's a valuable legal instrument. All this, in addition, all this erosion of democracy also happens in a context which is very disagreeable and dangerous too. Of questioning the OAS, especially in recent weeks. This has been very strong in my country. There's just been a meeting of ministers of the ECLAC, where the president of the Republic and weeks later the foreign minister spoke of the OAS as an agency that doesn't work any longer, which is clearly interfering. The president, López Obrador, even took some phrases from the 1960s talking about the OAS as the Ministry of the Colonies and so on. There's an attack, strong attack on the institution and an attempt to substitute it by other multilateral agencies which certainly have no viability, but which what they do is fuel the discredit, because the control of political discourse by leaders that are governing our countries, and the centralization of power, the attack on the opposition, on the mass media, and freedom of expression, all this fuels or feeds this feeling that democracy is good for nothing because it doesn't resolve my problems. So, defense of democracy, because all this goes together with policies, at least in Mexico, in which people are given some so-called social programs, in inverted commas. People are given money that enables them to cover their most basic needs, and therefore they don't question these populist regimes. And the defense of democracy remains in the hands of sectors which are more, let's say, privileged in society. The middle classes, which are also deteriorating successively, the intellectuals, and so on. So I believe that the great task we have ahead is to strengthen the democratic culture and reverse this process of discredit of democracy and of multilateral agencies that support democracy and human rights as universal values, essential values for peace and social coexistence. Then there are other issues that are also very insidious. I don't know if I can talk about them right now or later on, but which have also contributed very much to the deterioration of democratic coexistence or possibilities of democratic coexistence, which are related to violence and illegal economies, protection of illegal economies. In my country, in the countries of the North Triangle of Central America, is a brutally corrosive factor, not only of peace and civilization and civility, but also of democracy. Recently, your visit Santiago with a mission for electoral observation of the OAS in the latest elections we had in Mexico, which were intermediate elections, but where many of the governments in the country were involved. They were very well organized elections where finally there was prevalence of popular will in many areas, but in other areas they were dominated by violence and criminal organized crime groups who assassinated 150 participants in the electoral process, candidates, politicians, and so on. But they also established their dominion through these electoral processes in many municipalities, and I would dare to say even in states in the countries. This is another problem that also has corrosive impact, a brutal impact, and of course, inequality, which is still important and is a huge obstacle for democracy. As long as we cannot confront this kind of situation and provide viable alternatives, I'm afraid that we are going to continue in this situation of deterioration and erosion of the democracy. And of course, all this ideologization that you spoke about in your article on the 20 years of the Democratic Charter is an essential factor too. Democracy and human rights, the fact that human rights and democracy are not seen as values but have been substituted by ideological slogans, often very old, which shouldn't be current in today's world any longer. Unless we can change this, we will not be able to change this swing of this pendulum, which is moving very dangerously. So thank you, Maricler. You've also mentioned several issues which deserve special treatment, the subject of violence and
la violencia organizada,
organized crime groups or drug trafficking groups, how they affect democracies in some of the countries. This is a very important topic, and I had to confront it when I did the OAS mission. But I cannot say anything because I haven't yet submitted the report that has to be presented to the Permanent Council soon. But yes, it was one of the topics presented to the mission as one of the issues, central issues in some of the states regarding citizen participation and voting. We have to consider not only in Mexico, but also other countries in the region. It's the protection networks of these groups, the networks that protect these organized crime groups, and they are in all levels of the state. This happens in several countries, unfortunately. Another comment, and with this, I know the Secretary General loves football, so to send the ball back to him, the issue of questioning the OAS. I'm asking this because I heard the Secretary General talk in a presentation of a book on this subject. He was asked some questions and his answer was interesting. So first, I want to ask the Secretary General about the topic Maricler mentioned. And then the other question I would ask now is, the charter is not going to be changed. It's good. It contains as much as can be included in a document of this kind. But there is certain consensus that it hasn't worked as it should have if we consider the reality in the region. So what else can be done? There are several ideas. We've always tried to create an independent mechanism to try and make the charter work. Garcia said the first was the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, but it was immediately erased by the states. The example of Venezuela, during 15 years, the Inter-American Commission wrote reports on Venezuela criticizing rule of law in Venezuela, and the states ignored it completely. So there was a kind of short circuit. The Friends of the Inter-American Democratic Chart, we mentioned before, also endeavored to do so, but the states do not necessarily pay attention to it. Is there anything that can be done which have features of independence and which would mobilize the states? Are you thinking about anything like this? Can anything like this be done? The different general secretariats over the years have been thinking about this. So these two questions, Secretary General, questioning of the OAS, and can anything else be done? And you may have further comments on what we were talking about before, so the microphone is yours.
El mundo es libre de criticar a la organización.
Everybody's free to criticize the OAS how many times they want and however they want, in the way they want. The Organization of American States is a regional organization which is the oldest in the world. It's the multilateral agency that is the oldest in the world, and it has built up a legal corpus that is unique in the world. The dimension of inter-American rights, the protection of human rights, of democracy, the support of security, development are benchmarks anywhere. It's impossible to hear any international conference that doesn't make reference to the OAS. It's built upon very strong pillars. But I think the criticism is a bit stronger as to what Latin Americans and people from the Caribbean were not able to build for ourselves, having a relevant political forum that is exclusively Latin American and from the Caribbean. CELAC was going to be that. I'm a real fan of CELAC, and it seemed to me to be a fundamental element for dialogue with other regions in the world for the Latin Americans. And I think it's there where we should solve this issue and the best conditions for Latin America and the Caribbean to get together. We shouldn't confuse the European Union with the OAS. The OAS is multilateral. The European Union is a process of integration among countries. So two quite different things. However, we always take note of criticisms. We always learn from what is being said to us, and we should be open to any criticism that may be stated. What else can we do in the framework of the Inter-American Democratic Charter? And normally people make reference to mechanisms. The mechanisms in the Charter are broad enough to cover everything: good offices, mediation, negotiation, special missions like the one you had to El Salvador, Santiago, which had been also sent to other countries at the request in terms of Article 17 in Haiti, to Guatemala under Article 17, and I'm describing situations in the past few months with specific applications of the Charter to solve political issues in the hemisphere. So the Charter is current, and it's an immediate reference for countries when they need to solve institutional problems. The mechanisms in Article 17 onwards are broad, comprehensive, and flexible to create other actions such as work groups or special missions. I do think, and this was the idea of the creation of the Observatory for Democracy, we need to follow up on the institutional situation of countries. This may be a report nobody likes, as it happens with the report of the Commission on Human Rights, to analyze the institutional evolution of countries and mark the institutional risks and also risks of political operation that may be affected. I fully agree with what has been pointed out as to the structural problems of democracy. Some of them come from 2 centuries ago, certain structural poverty conditions. These are more than 200 years in some areas in Latin America. Violence is decades old. We are a very violent continent. Latin America has 8% of the world population and 38% of violent deaths in the hemisphere. There's a disproportion there. And COVID exposed our vulnerabilities highly and our structural weaknesses to face a pandemic. And those figures repeat 80% of the world population. At a certain moment, it was 40% of cases and victims. The issue of organized crime, corruption, are endemic and structural problems we could not solve in our countries. And these are issues in democracy looking for special conditions. I mean, one was aborted before its time and the other one was not renewed in time. And this is a topic that is important in the hemisphere, the fight against corruption. And I think the issue of the strength of the charter that has been implemented since 2002 with Chavez up to your mission to El Salvador, invoking the democratic charter some months ago. The charter has been implemented always with good criteria, and it has generated stability conditions. And when these conditions could not be created, we've had illegitimate governments, as in Venezuela, or the alteration of constitutional order in Nicaragua. Those topics has always been responded to by the Charter. Some issues may be missing, as Diego said, and also Maricler. We still lack that the penalties, those are the word in the charter. I mean, the maximum penalty or sanction is the suspension of the agency. That's not such a sensitive topic. When you feel threatened, when somebody feels threatened, they may leave alone, as we thought the Maduro regime would do. But the pocket is the most sensitive organ in the human body, and it's also sensitive for the countries. And financial issues should be connected to the democracy and democratic guarantees, because continuing to provide money for a government that stole sovereignty from its people or that doesn't respect its people's sovereignty, it's also a way to steal people. Michael, if you want to make a question or a comment, please do. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I've been 12 years following you, so I'm sure you have questions. But I think we now have to move to the questions from the audience, and there are several. Diego, maybe you can answer this question better, but it's open for you all. Why the Democratic Charter was not a convention that could have had a more binding power in connection to countries? For you, Diego, if you dare. Thus, consistent case law interpretation that this is a development of the OAS Charter, and as it was accepted by consensus without votes against it or abstentions or dissenting votes, and that was not questioned over 20 years, irrespective of how the implementation of the Charter is interpreted, gives it a binding character from the point of view of international law for many interpretations. But in any case, if there have been difficulties to implement the Charter that shouldn't be connected with its legal status, but with other components of the development of crisis, democratic crisis development in the countries. And insisting on this point, finally, a binding character, which I think it has in itself, will not guarantee that the Charter will be respected to the letter. Some things depend on the internal political dynamics, social and structural actors that Maricler has described so well, that will not be solved either under a charter or a constitution. This is an instrument to achieve certain results that requires certain practical conditions. And what we are describing, that is situations connected with the development of the institution of the internal democracy inside countries, it's not feasible to think that any number of resolutions, either binding or non-binding, adopted by the OAS could be above the dynamic of tensions, conflicts, internal polarization, authoritarianism, or anything that may happen in the countries. The democratic charter in this conception is a course with the good offices and mediation. It could reach solutions, institutional solutions, to find a way out. And this is connected with dialogue. Is dialogue always possible? No, sometimes it's not possible. There's not the will to dialogue, and the conditions to reach the dialogue are many times connected with interaction. I remember specific situations where, from the institutional presence of the OAS to the role of some countries or groups of countries that urge internal actors to act in line with the OAS. That's absolutely essential. So there are certain factors that will never be included in legal instruments such as the Charter, and that depend on circumstances for the Charter to operate or not. There's no way, in other words, for a severe democratic crisis that puts the country in a position to be suspended, to be solved without a decisive role of internal political actors. That happens in any country in Latin America, regardless of their size.
I would add that the fact that its convention does not ensure in any way that it will be followed more. There is low level of compliance by the states in this regard. You can look at the Democratic Charter as if it has been more efficient in some aspects than the Inter-American Convention itself. So it's not necessarily that it's a more efficient document. A question from Beatriz Rangel, you may know her. What is the role of inflexibility of the presidentialist institutions in this corrosion of democracy? Hasn't democracy been a system to take up caudillos, but not a really competitive system to renew leaderships? Has it not just helped to raise up popular leaders? I think it's a good question. And it's true, one of the serious problems we have in the region connected to this democratic regression is the crisis of representativity. The parties are not very representative of the will of the citizens. and citizens don't have very clear ideas about the scope of their rights. So, of course, clearly our tradition of caudillos or popular leaders encourages presidentialism. I see it every day in my country and also in Salvador, Chavez in his day, and so on and so forth. This popular leadership of caudillos in Latin American countries is well and alive and kicking. And this is something we have to face.
I
think that the Inter-American Democratic Charter needs to be made known more widely. It needs to be made known more widely in civil society of our countries. I could say, at least in my country, there have been 2 journalistic articles and 1 forum to speak about the 20 years of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And none of those journalistic articles really comes from, one is from an OAS official and another from an ambassador. And there was a forum at the Mexican University, at the Institute of Legal Investigations of the Mexican University, and that's it. If we have a survey tomorrow among the human rights organizations in the countries or the ones that fight in favor of democracy, few of them would know the charter, and few of them have studied the scope of the charter. To ask the OAS to do that work of making known, well, perhaps it's beyond the organization's possibilities on its own, but I do think it's something that civil society organizations should take on the task of making the charter very well known. And that, I think, will be the only way to mobilize the population regarding the values and guidelines of the charter. You've just answered another question by John Graham, who is one of the directors of the OAS promotion of democracy of the OAS in Canada many years ago. And he asked if the problem was at the municipal and local level, there is no education regarding democracy. I think, yes, this is one of the great challenges that we have, no doubt. A question for Luis. Economic and social rights are essential. As mentioned by the Secretary General, a democracy without this component can fail and fall in the temptation of populism. Why does the OAS concentrate only on electoral, free and fair elections and concentrate less on strengthening economic and social strengths or values? No, that's not the case. First, the question of applicability of inter-American law. I think that being a resolution, it is very important. First, because if it was a convention, many of them could have signed it at the time, but I don't know how many would have ratified it. But a resolution is current. Even if it hasn't been ratified, it's not necessary to undergo any of those processes. It's inter-American law because it's a resolution, and it's applied even to those who are suspended from the charter of the OAS charter, as specifically is the case of Cuba, which is still part of the inter-American system because it never reported the Charter of Bogota. The resolution is always more comprehensive. Applicability of inter-American law is a problem, whether for democracy or for human rights. That's a reality. I remember a conversation with the Inter-American Court of Justice a few years ago after Diego had left. 80% of the rulings, or the contents of the rulings of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights remained without enforcement. they were not enforced, they were not executed. This is clear. So to get to that point, obviously human rights had been violated, but not only after the ruling, they did not comply with that need of redress or victims or people or situations of human rights. In democracy, this happens to us frequently too. There is not great enforcement or applicability in a context of a convention. There is not greater enforcement even when there are jurisdictional elements as there are in the topic of human rights. The work on democracy is ongoing and connected to economic and social rights. I referred today very clearly to the Declaration of Managua, which its development has an essential role in the quality of democracies in our countries. I referred to the subject of inequality. These subjects, economic and social rights, we see how they deteriorate together with the deterioration of institutions. Case in Venezuela is very symptomatic in this regard. The institutions are eroded in their in the democratic operation until they stop providing answers to the needs. Those economic and social rights are often basic needs of the people: food, health, housing. Solutions do not come anymore from the institutions, and this is a serious problem that happens with deterioration of institutions. I also mentioned that, and the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is also connected to this, and the migratory crisis in Venezuela too. It's pervasive. The situation in Cuba also leads us to think about this. It's one of the essential references that we have. I think that many of the structural problems in democracy, as we have said, are connected to the lack of enforceability of those social and economic rights of the people and the lack of respect for those rights. Thank you, and we have to wrap up. There are many, many questions from several friends of mine and yours who I know will be offended because we won't have time to answer them all. But we hope to be able to do this later on. Send them in writing to Diego and Maricler. One question is referring to a current situation. What is the next step in El Salvador? Considering not only the mission that was conducted at its time, but something, I'm adding this now, what's the next step? What can be done to modify the situation in Salvador? When you look at the panorama of the region and the OAS itself, I haven't seen, beyond civil society, I haven't seen many reactions from the states about what's going on in Salvador in recent weeks. So would you like to say something about this? There has been a call for USA to make a statement, and they have made a statement. But beyond that, really, I think it has gone basically unnoticed, and it's a very, very serious situation. What should be done? I don't know what is being done by the OAS right now. At the Permanent Council, are they going to discuss it? Has the report been presented to the Permanent Council, your report, Santiago? So as from there, we should generate discussion. It hasn't been submitted yet, but it's already past history. Many things have happened since I wrote that report, which already criticized the situation in Salvador, but a lot more has happened since then.
Nosotros, obviamente,
Clearly, we have worked on the topic in this framework, and you are witnesses of sending the mission presided by Santiago, and we have communicated the situation of the judiciary as from May. On that basis and on basis of the announcements, as I said before, Article 20 assigns responsibility to the states and the General Secretariat. We also expect, but the subject is not yet in the Permanent Council's agenda. The General Secretariat has a job which is much slower. We do not react like NGOs. We have the obligation to document and write reports that sometimes take a long time and many pages, and this is clearly a process. Imagine the first report on Venezuela was practically 1 year after the takeover and after having reported the situation during 6 months, and it was a long report, 200 pages, which considered many different aspects. We always give the countries the right in all subjects. We just act subsidiarily when the situation reaches a certain gravity, and the technical report consider alterations of constitutional order or institutional construct, as referred to in your report, Santiago. And in this regard, Diego, yesterday you made a pronouncement on the independence of the judiciary in Salvador. Is that right?
Sí. Mira, hemos publicado un comunicado conjunto.
We published a joint statement yesterday, the Inter-American Commission and me as rapporteur. I just wanted to make a comment
del caso de Salvador, que es gravísimo, porque es algo que fuera del
which is really serious, because regardless of the geographical framework of the Inter-American system, in my condition as UN rapporteur, in what is characterized as an authoritarian wave in the world, the exception is the collapse of the independence of the judiciary, acting on Supreme Courts or Council of Magistrates or all those institutions. When, as in Fujimori, there was a coup d'etat to remove Congress and destroy public institutions, I think that's part of an exceptional circumstance, because today's pattern is to start by attacking the independence of the judiciary, which is really surprising. I mean, the delay to react by democratic countries and institutions, as in the example of Poland, where all solutions finally have been delayed for 4 to 5 years. And in the case of America, we see that the most populated country in Latin America has today, in the question of political threats on the interference with the judiciary, one of its fundamental aspects. What's going on in Brazil? So my impression is that it is a time for Latin American reflection to relocate or rethink the issue of the independence of the judiciary or the attack to the high court as a medular topic and one of the most relevant components of the deterioration of democratic institutions. I would suggest, and I'm willing to help, that it would be interesting to create a forum in the OAS coordinated with the dialogue, for instance, to discuss this topic and see what answers can be found. Not all countries may be very enthusiastic in being on the front line to organize this, but not all countries need to be the promoters. But I think it's very important that this goes beyond a local issue of somebody who wants to help a corrupt character and so that they want to remove a judge or a prosecutor, but at the most all prosecutors or former prosecutors who have investigated important cases in Guatemala are now living in the US because they had to leave not only their jobs, but their life is at risk and they had to emigrate. And this is a new phenomenon connected with something that is very important with its democratic evolution. Some judicial systems that are reasonably independent have been created, which in turn create discomfort because the personal election of judges is no longer ruling. So some progress has been achieved, but that progress is being threatened right now. And I think this will be an important topic in the near future. Thank you very much, Diego. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I do agree, and I've said this on different occasions, with Diego and with the Secretary General as to the silence of states, which sometimes is really surprising, and the lack of leadership in our countries and the world in general in these matters is more than alarming. And the goal of these types of meetings is try to raise our voice on these issues and try to achieve some changes. And I'll take your word, Diego, to move on in this connection. And Luis, you have the final floor. But I would like to give my floor to Michael, who has been listening to all of us very quietly. Well, I thank you all for a very interesting panel and discussion. I'm a bit more depressed than when I started. But just one final reflection is that I imagined if the democratic charters were being written today, 20 years later, presented to the OAS member states, what the reaction would be. I think the reaction would be quite different in a different world. And I think this reflects the huge change and the deterioration of the situation and the region in terms of democracy, the rule of law, but also the lack of will to act. That's really worrisome, and it's a measure of the reflection of the changes over these years. We hope this some strength, leadership, commitment, will can be recovered to act. Otherwise, we are facing huge risks. And I do support the suggestion by Diego, and I've discussed this with Santiago. It's absolutely fundamental, and there is where the whole erosion we are seeing in the region starts. We need to face that and respond more aggressively and clearly. So I thank you all for the valuable participation of the Secretary General Diego, Maricler, Santiago. Thank you very much for your questions and your time. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all the questions. I was reading them all. They are all very good, high quality questions from people with a lot of experience. So I want to thank all the participants in this event. Can I answer to you, Michael, what would happen if the Democratic Charter were submitted today after the first reaction, as when the Inter-American Commission happened, only the title would remain? consensus as the one reached at the time would not be reached today. And that means that paper is much longer standing than human actions. It was a time where Peru and the region were going through a special moment. Today, we are living in an important institutional erosion time in 3 or 4 places that would make this institutional advance impossible. But as paper is a long-standing element, we are going to celebrate this by unanimity. I think all countries are happy to celebrate the 20 years of the Democratic Charter, even the countries that in your heads may be violating the Charter from beginning to end. Yes, thank you very much again, and I do hope